All right, let's see here. Okay, it looks like we are live. We're going to see how long it takes anybody to start actually looking at this thing, and we're going to kind of see where things go. It's just sort of informal. Put this thing together, sort of at the last minute. I got one viewer. All right, I tell you what, this thing's filling up. Not there's any limit to the amount of people. Oh, 56 here. It says 56. So I've got more than one person. All right. So y'all go ahead. Let me know on Twitter. I'm going to take a look at the tweets at Tom Richey. If you're watching from tomrichey.net/hangouts, make sure if you haven't yet signed up for my APUSH email list that you do that, because the people on my email list, they find out when I'm doing a live hangout, when I post a new video, when I've got some kind of resource that will help people out for their APUSH exam. So make sure that if you're watching at tomrichey.net/hangouts that you join the mailing list and all that kind of stuff. All right, looks like y'all are telling your friends. We've got 85 people right now. Very excited about that. So let's go ahead and check the Twitter and see what's going on here. All right, so let's see. I'm waiting for the first question on Twitter. And while I do that, thank you so much, Miss Phillips, for promoting this hangout. Miss Phillips class at, let's see where this is, at RVHS, Arrowhead and National Geographic Certified Educator. If Miss Phillips students are watching, y'all be sure to let me know here. All right, so Paul has asked something about the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800. What happened and why is it important? Okay, so let me go ahead and start off with that. I've got a question there about the Revolution of 1800. Now, of course, that gets into a historiographical issue. When we talk about historiography, we're talking about how history is interpreted and written and rewritten. So, Jefferson's Revolution of 1800, of course, he would call it that point of view Jefferson. He's being swept into office. He's the opposition candidate. And this really represents the first peaceful transfer of power by an election without any bloodshed in the modern world. All right, that there was an election and one party voluntarily gave power to another. Now, how big of a difference did it make? Okay, so on one hand, Jefferson could say, oh, yeah, it's a revolution. But at the same time, if we think about in terms of the judiciary, certainly wasn't a revolution that John Adams was able to put John Marshall on the bench, who continued to be the Supreme Court Chief Justice until the 1830s, was replaced by Andrew Jackson over 30 years later. We could think about, how Jefferson and the Jeffersonian presidents really were never able to get like-minded people on the bench. They thought that, okay, we can put appointees on the federal bench that will judge the way we want them to. Didn't happen that way. Really, the Federalists continued to be on the bench. The National Bank continued through its charter in, around 1811. It expired. The charter expired, and that was the end of that then. But Jefferson didn't take back the charter or anything like that. And so there are a lot of things there that Jefferson necessarily didn't do. Now, what Jefferson did, Jefferson certainly trimmed the federal budget. He got rid of Hamilton's whiskey tax and really all internal taxes Jefferson got rid of. But the thing is that the changes were not as radical as Jefferson might have wanted them to seem. In fact, Alexander Hamilton told his Federalist friends when the election was contested between Jefferson and Burr, y'all should vote for Jefferson because Jefferson's actually a more reasonable and pragmatic and moderate guy, whereas Burr is complete scum of the earth and very dogmatic as well. And so when it came down to it, Jefferson showed a sense of pragmatism. When you think about the Louisiana Purchase, that really tested Jefferson's commitment to the absolutely strict, almost ridiculously strict construction of the Constitution. Because when you're looking at the Louisiana Purchase, when the Constitution says that the Congress can make treaties, all right, the President Congress can make treaties. Well, what happens with treaties? Land changes a lot. So, it's not too much of a stretch to put that in the implied powers. But Jefferson, if he had it his way, there'd be a constitutional amendment saying, okay, we want to make it absolutely clear in the text of the Constitution that it's expressly delegated that the government can add land to the United States. Now, Jefferson's friends finally convinced him, that's a little bit ridiculous, and Jefferson's pragmatic side kicks in there. So that's really the significance of the so-called Revolution of 1800. Now, we've got some more folks here. World War I, Zarbach, that's a little bit out there, okay? A little bit out there. Let's see. So Bryn, who's here, just finished reading the chapter about the lead up to the Civil War. Wow, people are in a lot of different places right now. But Bryn, because Bryn has quoted Vin Scully in her Twitter profile, even though she's a Giants fan, we'll forgive her, partly because her team sucks and is not in the World Series. Go Dodgers. All right, so make sure y'all are watching the World Series tonight. I will quit by the time the first pitch is thrown about 8:20 p.m. Eastern. So the Mexican War really represents, when we're thinking about the lead into the Civil War, that the Mexican War gives all this land to the United States in the form of the Mexican Cession. Well, slavery had really been, had been settled when it comes to the states that were already there. Remember, the Missouri Compromise in 1820 divided slavery at the Louisiana Purchase at the 3630 parallel. So if somebody was above 3630, if there's land above 3630, then that is going to be closed to slavery. Below 3630, that's going to be open to slavery. Now, that was already settled, but all of a sudden this new land comes in and people have got to figure out, what are we going to do with this land? And, you have now the group of free soilers who have started to get power. Now, remember, when talking about the anti-slavery movement, you've got the abolitionists, the dogmatic, like slavery is wrong. We need to get rid of it now. We need to get rid of it immediately because it's wrong. The free soilers are really more pragmatic and, really more racially driven than anything else. Although scholars will go back and forth how much, how powerful racism was a force in free soil. But you can look at some of the cartoons at the time. It's pretty obvious. These people, they wanted a white West to get away from black people. Okay. So when it comes down to it, the free soilers, they didn't have a problem with slavery where it was in the South, but they had a problem with the spread of slavery. Now, when we're looking at the Mexican War as a turning point, you're seeing that before that, you had the balance between slave states and free states. Ever since the Missouri Compromise, it's like, okay, let's let Missouri in as a slave state, but we're going to create an additional free state out of Maine. And so in the 1820s, 1830s, early 1840s, it's like, okay, slave state, free state, free state, all of that. The free soilers aren't having any of this, all right? So you have this controversy when California wants to come in as a free state, as a large free state. Whereas the South, and the politicians from the South, they're saying we need to have two states here, a slave state and a free state. We can't let this big old free state come in. And so then you've got that argument there. And of course, the Mexican Cession, the rest of the Mexican Cession, of course, the Compromise of 1850, California comes in as free state. Popular sovereignty in the Mexican Cession. We pass the buck, let the settlers deal with it. All right. So, which works fine in the Mexican Cession, doesn't work so great when they try to apply it in Kansas, where a lot of people end up dying. So, you've got what's going on out there. Now, then, of course, you've got the Texas issue, because Texas says that its boundary is in Santa Fe. Its boundary includes Santa Fe, whereas the federal government says, no, your boundary does not include Santa Fe. Well, they settle that, okay? They decide that they're going to settle that for, money. They're going to pay off Texas war debt, $10 million at the time, which, is more than $10 million now, I reckon. And then finally, you get to the slave trade in Washington, D.C. And the slave trade in Washington, D.C., some people wanted slavery to be gotten rid of, entirely. Some people, of course, continued to be for it. After all, remember that Washington, D.C. was right in between two slave states, Maryland and Virginia. So, what happens here is they decide, okay, we're going to compromise. We're going to get rid of the slave trade, okay, not slavery itself, but the slave trade. There's one, I've just been through 2 straight tutoring sessions. I know there's one more, but we'll just go ahead and move on from there. Bren, hopefully that answered your question about the Mexican-American War as a turning point. Okay, so a little bit about Jacksonian stuff here. Leon, okay, got your question here. A few things here. Now, the spoil system, oh my goodness, Jack sent me his whole freaking study guide, okay? Jack, I don't think I'm going to get to your entire study guide, but hopefully life continues to be so good. But there are a few things here I think that we're going to see there. The spoils system. So Andrew Jackson comes in. Now, of course, you know, Jackson, from his point of view, when he goes in and basically fires everybody. Now, this is something, remember when I was talking about the Revolution of 1800, that Jefferson, when he came in office, he didn't fire everybody from their jobs. But Jackson comes in, and of course, we're switching to more of a democracy. So the thing about democracy is when a politician gets elected to office, they owe somebody, okay? That democracy, you got to get out the vote, and you owe people in certain states that delivered those votes to you. And so from one level, Jackson is taking the people out. He is putting his own people in there. And people are getting upset about that because, you know, to the victor go the spoils. It looks like Jackson is rewarding his own people, which, you know, I guess, you know, he's doing. There's a fair argument for that. Now, Jackson would say that government service should not be a job. All right. So Jackson says that when it comes down to it, I'm just cleaning house. That, you know, one party gets in, their people come in, and then when the next party gets in, they get rid of them. People shouldn't be so comfortable in a government job. But essentially, the spoils system is this idea. Now, this goes to it's the 1880s when civil service is implemented. Like used to, the president could fire everybody down to like the local postmaster. Could be fired and, you know, by the president replaced. And now most federal jobs are covered by civil service where you take an exam and you get in there and your job, unless you do something, you know, that's against your contract or something like that, you keep that job, you know, for until you retire. But that wasn't the case then. There was no federal civil service. So the spoils system. Now, then the tariff of abominations. Now, the tariff of abominations was actually passed during the John Quincy Adams administration. And this was the highest tariff that had ever been passed. There were some people that were actually, they put stuff in there thinking they were trolling and that it wasn't going to pass. So they were trolling the bill by, you know, just ramping up some things. So they thought surely people won't vote for this. And then even with those hostile amendments, it passed. And so it created the highest tariff in U.S. history, even higher than the Hawley Smoot tariff during the Depression, which is the second highest. So as far as that goes, you've got, you know, this, you know, now this high tariff, and it's disproportionately affecting the South. Okay. What's important here is that the South still had an economy that was based on cash crops, and the South really accounted for a great deal of the foreign trade. And what the Southern economy was based on was the old Jeffersonian economic model. You remember Jefferson wanted zero manufacturing, that they can manufacture in Europe in their dirty cities, and, you know, don't mess with that over here because it's dirty and nasty and filthy and bad for republicanism. Small r, not necessarily the party, but the way of life. And so, you know, Jackson, you know, inherits this tariff of abominations where now the South, which had basically been exporting cash crops and importing finished goods from Europe, the same as this Jeffersonian economic model, now they can't do that anymore. Or they can do it, but they're paying a heavy price. Whereas what's going on with Henry Clay and the American system and the Whig Party, what they're trying to do, or the National Republicans, as they were known at that time, what they'd like to do is have home industry. All right. So we're trading, you know, we've got an internal trade instead of relying on Europe. Now, if we go back a little bit, Henry Clay had been a war hawk. I wish I could make hawk sounds, but I'm not very good at it. And so as far as that goes, Henry Clay wanted people trading internally, not externally. Okay. And so basically his vision for the United States was to have northern manufacturers trading with southern cash crops. And so that way we don't have to trade with Europe. Remember, as far as that goes, let's see, that's about the same. Let me just open this up so I've got a visual for you. I think that'll work a little bit better here. All right, so the nullification crisis, let me take a look here. Okay, so the Jeffersonian economic model is really the same economic model that had been used in previous, you know, all the way back to the colonies, all right, all the way back to colonial America. So raw materials and finished goods. So for this to work, trade was pretty essential. But the War of 1812 showed people that you can't always depend on this type of trade, all right? And so essentially with Henry Clay's American system, what he's got in mind, let's see, Henry Clay's America, where we've got all of this stuff here. So you've got northern manufacturing. Of course, you've got the national bank, which can be used to, basically to, subsidize northern manufacturing, to invest in economic development in the West. The West and the middle states are creating staple crops. The South has cash crops. So Henry Clay has this whole thing going on where, you've got this internal trade, and that is going against the Jeffersonian economic model that the South was still attached to. And so that's really the essence of the nullification crisis. Now, of course, speaking of Jefferson, you may remember the Kentucky Resolution, where Jefferson then, what he said when at the Adams administration and Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, then Jefferson said, look, in the Kentucky Resolution, now Madison said the states could interpose, they can get in the middle of this, but Jefferson wrote that any federal law that is against the Constitution is void and of no force. Essentially, a single state can just ignore a federal law. So Jefferson has already planted the seeds of nullification when he said this, when he said that, look, this law is void. And so when you look at the Constitution, it says that the Congress can tax. Okay, the Congress can tax. We see here, let me go ahead and make a little note. And I'm going to make a video about this at some point, but just haven't gotten around to it yet. My slides are almost finished for this. But Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, meaning tariffs, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Well, what Calhoun and the South Carolinians are claiming is that the tariff of abominations as a protective tariff, okay? This was not a tariff that was passed to raise money to finance the government. This was a tariff that was passed with the goal of promoting manufacturers, which did not promote the general welfare of the United States or the common defense. It didn't pay any debts or anything like that. When you look here at the votes for the tariff of 1828, you see that the South voted overwhelmingly against it, whereas the mid-Atlantic states voted overwhelmingly for it. Now, remember, New England at that time, their economy was still somewhat dependent on shipping. So depending on what part of New England, are you representing one of those coastal shipping areas or an interior manufacturing area, would depend on how you vote. And of course, Henry Clay, just like with the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, Henry Clay in 1833, this was his second of three compromises where he proposed the compromise tariff of 1833. Andrew Jackson was ready to just go in there and start hanging people left and right. But Henry Clay was able to get this. South Carolina accepted the deal, Clay's compromise proposal, and then they nullified the force bill. Okay, so that was, that was basically their last kind of hurrah there, was we're going to nullify this force bill, which Congress had said that Jackson can send people in there. But remember that Henry Clay is known for three compromises: the Missouri Compromise, the Nullification Compromise, and the Compromise of 1850. All right, let's go back to Twitter at Tom Richey, and let's see what is going on there. Can I explain the impact of the Second Great Awakening? Thomas, I have a video on the Second Great Awakening, the Quasi-War. Now, Brandu. All right, Brandu. All right, Dodger Davis. All right, is he pulling for the Dodgers tonight? The Quasi-War is exactly what it sounds like. It's not really a war. It is an undeclared naval war between France and the United States in the late 1790s during the Adams administration. And this was used as a justification by the government to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, because they said that we are right now in a state of war, and so therefore we don't need all these people speaking against the government and all of that kind of stuff. We need to all be on the same page. But there was not a declared war going on at this time, and that's very important. So that's essentially, the Quasi-War was the pretext for the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay. So cultural and political occurrences. Yeah, Thomas Murray, look at my video on the Second Great Awakening. We've got more Baptists and Methodists. There is, evangelical religion is spreading. And of course, this is something that the Second Great Awakening is really given rise to the social activism. When you look at temperance, abolitionism, prison reform, of course, is a side effect of that. Well, side effect sounds bad, so I'm not going to use that term in reference to women voting, because that's not what what I mean at all. So, you know, as far as that goes, that would be a consequence because women were mostly, were most of the activists here in the temperance movement, the anti-slavery movement, and the prison reform movement. And they realized, you know, we don't get a lot of, a lot of respect here. And so as a result of that, you know, women are thinking, hey, we need to be able to vote too. So you've got the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which is the first, the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments is the first document, formal document in U.S. history to openly call for the enfranchisement of women. All right. So yes, Bren, I will always roast your team. Your team is awful. All right. So could you brief us on the economic and political causes of the revolution? Now, are we talking about the American Revolution, I presume? Now, one thing I'm working on, now let me just explain to you, some of you are probably like on an AB block or you meet every day. Some of you may be in a first semester AP US history class. Now, mine has a half credit lab in the fall, and then we have our proper course in the spring. So we're a little bit behind as far as content, but as far as the American Revolution, one thing that I'm working on that I'll kind of preview for you, just real quick here before I get to, let's see, what's the next question I'm getting to? Daniela, I have not forgotten about you. Okay, so let's just make sure, Daniela, that I get to your question there. All right, what's up, Kelly Kim? All right, good to see you here. Speculator, all right, speculator, or whatever that is. Okay, so as far as this goes, let me go ahead and share my screen with you, because when we look at what's leading into the American Revolution, one of the projects that I'm working on right now is the French and Indian War as a turning point. Okay, so just a little bit of like way back review for some of you. The French and Indian War is a turning point. Now, this all starts, okay, with the Navigation Acts. All right, the Navigation Acts, which were passed in 1651 to 1663, several bills, that's why they call it acts plural. The Navigation Acts govern overseas trade in Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, the Navigation Acts are often associated with mercantilism. These are trade policies that were designed to discourage trade with other nations. Now, what was going on is the Dutch, who are awesome, were just totally outmaneuvering the British in terms of shipping rates and all of that. This was during the Dutch Golden Age, for those of you who've taken AP Euro previously. And so mercantilism describes trade policies that are designed to discourage trade with other nations and give preference to British ports. And so this was passed so that, you know, British ships would only trade with British ports. Now, the thing about that, though, is that they were not enforced. Okay, this is really, the enforcement was a bit like this, you know, the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. That before the French and Indian War, the goal was to promote trade. And so the Navigation Acts were not enforced. The colonies were treated with what's called salutary neglect. Imagine your parents leaving you alone for the weekend while they travel. They leave a couple $100s and they say, you know, take care of yourself and all that kind of stuff. And you're like, hey, you know, I can kind of like this for a little while until you have to, you know, wash your clothes or something like that, or the food they left in the fridge runs out, or the money or whatever. But salutary neglect is good neglect. So the British Parliament passed these Navigation Acts, but they didn't enforce them. Now, during the French and Indian War, the British came to several conclusions. Now, the first of these being the colonists were unable to effectively respond to the French threat on their own. The British military intervention in North America was expensive, resulting in massive debt. The British troops also should be permanently stationed in North America. And since they're going to be permanently stationed in North America, the colonists should pay for their upkeep. So this is really the difference that the French and Indian War has in policy. And so after the French and Indian War, the British government goes from a goal of promoting trade to a goal of getting direct revenue from the colonies. And so this really starts with the enforcement of the Navigation Acts, the passage of the Sugar Act, the end of the policy of salutary neglect, and of course the Stamp Act, which is going to infuriate the colonists who had never been directly taxed by Parliament. So you go from really this laissez-faire mentality to this mentality of strict enforcement, and that's going to result in, you know, what's going on there in the colonies. Also, let me recommend my 8-month writing clinic while I've got y'all here. That my 8 month writing clinic actually goes through a DBQ on the American Revolution, and this is something that, you know, if you're serious about writing and stuff like that, and you want some additional help, I do a broadcast every month. This is a subscription based service. You know, starts as low as $27. If you want to take a look at that, I'm going to tweet it right now. So the you know, check out my 8 month writing clinic. So we've got that, and that's an option for you if you really want to go into depth. All right, so that's going to be there. Now, Daniela, can I explain the era of good feelings? Okay, I would be more than happy to do that. All right, so Daniela, the era of good feelings was this time between the first party system and the second party system. So the first party system, the Federalist and the Jeffersonian Republicans, sometimes called the Democratic Republicans. I'm not crazy about that term, but the Jeffersonian Republicans, you know, I think is a little bit more accurate. Jefferson just called his party the Republican Party. But anyway, this was the first party system. And this party system fell apart as a result of the War of 1812 and the Hartford Convention. The Hartford Convention, they had some reasonable demands. I mean, if you look at the demands that they made, that, you know, maybe we should have 2/3 consent for new states, you know, and some other things like that, that there should be 2/3 of Congress to get a full embargo, that Congress, you know, to regulate trade and to cut off trade. Those are two totally different things. But there was some language there that they said, and it was near the end of the War of 1812, that they said, if our concerns aren't addressed, we're going to meet in 6 months in Boston to take whatever measures are necessary. Secession. All right, that essentially they're trying to say here that, hey, if nobody listens to us, secession is on the table. And then within like the same week, we hear that, hey, Jackson got a victory at New Orleans, and it was like a really awesome victory, and we just beat the British. Then we hear that, oh, by the way, the war's over. Made the Treaty of Ghent, made by people who had no knowledge of the Battle of New Orleans, and so that is another thing that's going on there. And so then the Hartford Convention, we find out, oh, there are these New Englanders that, like, Jackson just scored this great victory, and these New Englanders aren't so into it. Okay, the Federalists, they're traitors. So they really were branded as an un-American party. So the Federalists, after the War of 1812, ceased to be able to compete in national elections. 1816 was the last time we saw the Federalists on the ballot for president. And so in 1820, you had the election of James Monroe. So basically, you have this kind of one-party system between 1816 and 1824. And this is also kind of a transition between an aristocratic republic and a democratic republic, because in 1824 you're going to start to see the rise of Jacksonian democracy, and that's going to be a big game changer. So that's something to keep in mind there as you think that era of good feelings. We associate that with James Monroe, and that it's a time between the party systems. Now, also remember that this wasn't necessarily just a bed of roses all the time. This is where the Missouri Compromise is going on. Then again, you know, although the Missouri Compromise was, you know, the Missouri issue was a big issue for a lot of people, they were able to compromise it. So, you know, this is really one of those things that even though there were some disagreements, they had ways of working through those disagreements. So, you know, let's see. Hopefully that helped you out a little bit, Daniela. Let's see if there are any questions. You know, the World Series is about to start in a little bit. I don't want to compete with that. So as far as that, the Massachusetts school law of 1647, my good, that sounds a little bit early. You might mean 1847, like Horace Mann and public education, I think is what you're thinking about there. So as far as that goes, now it looks like our viewership's gone down a little bit. We've gone for about half an hour, which sounds pretty good. You know, I'd like to do this more often. So remember that if you're not on my email list, if you go to tomrichey.net/APUSH, you can subscribe to that, know when stuff's going on. Take a look at my 8-month writing clinic. If you'd like to improve your writing and you have some questions about that, I'd be glad to help you. All kinds of stuff there. Also, we're thinking about discounting my Romulus app this week to 99 cents, down from the regular $2.99. So consider that as well. And I will be back soon. You know, I'll try to do these, you know, now and then. And thank y'all for showing up. It's always a pleasure.